Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I am very pleased to have on two very special people who, one, of course, we all know, Jonathan Neville, frequent
Hello.
guest. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
And I got a new guest here that I've known him since last summer when we met he gave me a ride to the Mormon History Association from his condo in downtown Salt Lake City, which I presume is where you're talking to us from today. And we got to know each other on that ride. James Lucas, retired attorney, and just now a newly minted resident of Utah. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You're originally you spent most of your life in New York, is that correct?
New York City. All my adult life was spent in New York City until a year ago.
Well, welcome to Zion. I just wanted to remind the audience real quick. This is for the April book drawing. We have Battlefields, Temple Grounds, Latter-day Saints in Guam and Micronesia, edited by my friend Devin Jensen of BYU. He gave me an extra copy last time I was in Utah, so I'm giving it away. So in the description is my email. Make sure that when you put in the subject box book contest, give me your name and address, U.S. residents only. Entries have to be in by April 30th. Okay, so the reason I had these two gentlemen on is they just came out with this book, by means of the Urim and Thummim, Restoring Translation to the Restoration, written by James Lucas and Jonathan Neville. And I want to read something here because I think this is an important thing that's on the back of the book that really opened a lot of people's eyes. And when I read it to them, they were shocked because a lot of people hadn't seen the book yet. Lucas and Neville's by means of the Urim and Thummim is a substantial contribution to the translation debates that have roiled Book of Mormon scholarship for the past 20 years. It is conservative in that it restores the preeminent role of the Urim and Thummim in the translation process and virtually erases the Seer stone from the story. It also proposes a translation theory of its own that preserves the importance of the Urim and Thummim and yet accounts for the presence of the language from Joseph Smith's world. All readers who take the translation debate seriously must reckon with this book. Richard Lyman Bushman. He's taken this work very seriously, and it's funny because I've known for a very long time, almost 2 years ago, June of this year is when I interviewed Jonathan Neville. I interviewed Jonathan Neville for the first time in May of 2021, and then I interviewed Richard Bushman in June of 2021. And I asked Richard Bushman about Jonathan Neville and the work that he's doing vis-a-vis his views on the plates, and also Jonathan Edwards. And Richard Bushman said it, I can say it publicly now because he just praises the book effusively, is that he told me that Jonathan Neville is a radical thinker in the best sense of the term. So I knew I was on the right course, that I was talking to the right guy. And so, Jonathan, it's really exciting just to kind of see your work that you've been doing is getting more and more scholarly recognition. Of course, James, you are the co-author on this as well. But Jonathan, maybe just talk a little bit about what it's like to see finally your work is getting recognized by the scholarly community and being taken. I mean, if Richard Bushman is taking your work seriously, you're doing serious work.
Well, I'm not in the academic world, and so this is not like a career. I've had people tell me I should have gotten a PhD in history for some of my early books, on the times and seasons and so on. But for me, it's just an avocation. It's a labor of love, sort of. I'm just fascinated by all of this, but I'm also focused on solving problems. That's what I'm hoping to do, and bringing reconciliation among different groups. And it's difficult because, as you know, I'm going against a lot of the LDS traditions that have built up over the years, particularly with the Book of Mormon setting and origin. But I'm just happy to have people be willing to look at another point of view. And in my experience, Richard Bushman is probably the most open-minded LDS scholar today. He's not a gatekeeper. He doesn't have an organization that he's trying to build up and raise money for. Well, his arts, but that's a different topic. But he's just an honest guy that's doing the best he can, and he's very smart, and he has a lot of experience. But he is not about defending his agenda or what he's been saying over the years, like so many of the other LDS scholars. And he's not an apologist either, which is refreshing. So I have tremendous respect for Richard, and I appreciate that he's looked at some of the things that I've tried to contribute as well.
I think that is great. And yeah, and he's such a wonderful human being. I kind of update him every year. I see him at Mormon History Association, and he's just always so curious about the work I'm doing. And I remember last year, I go to him and gave him and said, "Yeah, it's been a year since you've been on my show," and I told him about how the channel's been growing, and he looked at me and said, "Well, this time." I told him, I said, "I'd love to have you anytime you want to come back on the program to talk about anything, just let me know." And he goes to me and said, "Well, this time you'd be doing me the favor."
That's good. Well, you know, the other thing I really appreciate about him is his arts involvement.
Yeah.
You can see I'm in my studio here. And in fact, I have a new painting here about Hill Cumorah, which if we get around to it, we could talk about it. But I do a lot of landscape type things, but also church history things. And so his involvement with the arts is very fascinating to me, and I'm very sympathetic with him on all that as well. So
yeah, you have a lot in common with each other. So James, I just want you to, since you're new to the show and my audience may not be familiar with you, maybe just give a little bit of your background. I know you've done some scholarship in the past as well, dealing with Mormonism. So just kind of give us a little background on you.
Okay. I'm of Utah Mormon ethnic background, but actually grew up in the New York suburbs. And then I went to BYU and then to Columbia Law School and stayed in New York City to practice law for my entire adult lifetime, like I said, until moving to Salt Lake City last year. I'm active Latter-day Saint. When I was in New York, I had the privilege of working with a group of people that was led by Richard and Claudia Bushman, who studied the history of Latter-day Saints in New York. So I did some writing on that subject. And then I guess my other main activity in the area of LDS subjects is that about 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago now, Warner Woodworth and Warner's was a professor at BYU, wrote a book called Working Towards Zion, Principles of the United Order for the Modern World, in which we studied the history of the concept of Zion in LDS tradition, and then kind of developed some principles, derived some principles from that, and then spent the other half of that was the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book was spent talking about applications in the modern world. So that book, and then for a period of time after that, I tended to write more on constitutional issues. But then my longtime friend Jonathan, so Jonathan and I have known each other for decades, literally, was getting involved more heavily in LDS history subjects, and I got sucked in. I especially was intrigued by his work on the area of translation, and decided I'd like to plunge in and carry forward his work. So our new book is basically carrying forward the foundation that Jonathan laid in his book, Man Who Can Translate. But we've done new research and, updated it, and have new research, new approaches. It's also kind of a shorter book. So that's what this new book is carrying forward that particular.
Yeah, and
let me mention one other thing here, Steve. You're familiar with this book, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So right in here on page XXIII 13,
Mm-hmm.
Richard mentions Jim.
He
says, yes. He says, I have called on friends to read chapters along the way. James Lucas in New York City has willingly taken on every kind of manuscript I thrust upon him and told me what I was thinking before I knew it myself. So Jim's been involved with this book as well. And so he's very conversant with church history. And I think he doesn't usually bring that up, but I thought your listeners would be interested to know his involvement with Rough Stone Rolling.
Yeah, and so we're dealing with two people who aren't the conventional scholars in the sense, but I also think that sometimes outsiders coming in can maybe see things. A lot of academics kind of have their blinders on, their area of specialty that they focus on, which is fine. You need that, but sometimes you're going to have blind spots on the bigger picture of things as well. And I think that this very fascinating hypothesis that you came up with is that basically you guys basically believe that the seer stone was not being used in the translation process, that the stone in the hat, and speaking of hats, by the way, I did get one of James gave
Oh,
this to me last time I was here.
it's
Okay,
what
show
I've
the
got a
back.
blue
Show the
one.
back.
Ooh, the blue one. I like the blue one. And of course, yeah, then you
Yeah.
got the hat, the anti-hat hat. So, but it's so fascinating because like of course, I'm an outsider, and I tell people, I say, one thing I like about Jonathan Neville's approach to The Man That Can Translate and Jonathan Edwards' influence on the Book of Mormon is that essentially it's his explanation is 99% naturalistic and 1% maybe supernatural. And then but the stone in the hat hypothesis is 99% supernatural and 1% natural. And I'm always going to favor the naturalistic argument over the supernatural just as a default possession. And that's what most scholars do as well. And so I need to ask you guys, where did this story come about there being a stone in the hat? And of course, let's contrast that with the dominant narrative that the church had taught, that he was using Urim and Thummim and all this kind of stuff, and then he was using spectacles. And I also think it's so important the spectacles are key, because even in Lucy Max Smith's account, Joseph was more intrigued by those spectacles than he was by the plates. There was something about those spectacles that were special. So maybe just talk about where did the stone in the hat thing come in, and then let's start talking about the spectacles.
You want me to take
Go ahead,
this
Jim.
one, John?
Yeah, sure.
So basically, if you take it in chronological order, Joseph and the primary original eyewitnesses were Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, and their accounts, they left several accounts in writing, written during their lifetimes, often written by themselves or with their assistants, just talking about the translation of the Book of Mormon. And in all cases, they stated that it was done, by means of or through the medium of the Urim and Thummim. So that was the dominant narrative that everyone
Jim,
followed.
let me stop you right there. When they said the Urim and Thummim, they specified it was the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates. It wasn't this ambiguous term.
Right. So that's important to note, is that they would specify it was what came the interpreters. In fact, Oliver Cowdery was very specific. He said it is the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites called them, the interpreters. And in fact, in the book, we kind of try to use the term interpreters more often, just to make sure that distinction is clear. And this is I would note, a distinction that everyone who was involved in the translation made. So even those who are cited as supporters for the stone in the hat theory, which I'll mention in 2 seconds, like Emma Smith and David Whitmer, even they made that distinction in their statements, that when they're referring to the Urim and Thummim, they were talking about the interpreters, their spectacles, and they spoke of the seer stone as being a separate object. So in any event, that was the prevailing narrative. And it was then in the 1870s. There's some scattered references. Oh, well, obviously the first time we really hear about in the historical record, the stone in the hat, is Mormonism Unveiled. And in Mormonism Unveiled, which is the first major anti-Mormon book published in 1834, they're trying to account for Mormonism and the Book of Mormon in particular, and that's where the Spalding theory was first presented, but that's also where the stone in the hat was first presented. And the author Eber Howe made the point. There's his stories that Joe used his seer stone in his hat and didn't even look at the plates. In which case, what's the point of these witnesses whose statements they put in the Book of Mormon? And that was one of his arguments that he used in Mormonism Unveiled. So,
let me mention one point there, because after they talked about the stone on the hat, they also talked about the Urim and Thummim as a separate explanation on the same page. So they were distinguishing between the two. Yeah.
Right.
And one other thing that you didn't mention was the very first discussion of the translation was in those Palmyra and Rochester newspapers. Shortly, it was like in September of 1829. And there they said that Joseph put spectacles in the hat. So it was obviously hearsay, because, and we've discussed that in the book, but that's the very first one, but it was kind of vague, and it didn't talk about a seer stone. And then
In fact,
Mormonism and Veil talked about a peep stone is the term they used.
right. So we have there's a scholar named Craig Osler who's at BYU, or was at BYU. He's retired now, who did really a major study of all the earliest accounts of the uh, translation instruments, and overwhelmingly, until the peepstone comes up in Mormonism Unveiled, they refer to sometimes. There's a couple of places, like Jonathan mentions, where they refer to the hat, but they always refer to them as either the stones, plural, or the spectacles.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the predominant term, even in non-Mormon accounts, up in the early days. And he did an exhaustive survey, which we cite in the book, of those. So moving forward, we have, however, the stone in the hat story. It was in Mormonism Unveiled. It kind of circulated a little bit. And in the 1870s, you had two people, William McClellan and David Whitmer, who sort of glommed onto the stone in the hat story, and it sort of served their purposes to promote that story about the translation. And we go into the book, particularly David Whitmer's motivations for focusing on the stone in the hat story. So what you get in the 1870s and 1880s is suddenly a flurry of accounts. Well, not a flurry, a few people leave accounts describing the stone in the hat, but it's really not until that point that it really gets wide notice. And all of these accounts, so you have accounts from three people who probably have some credibility. One is Emma Smith, the other is Martin Harris, who are both scribes, and then David Whitmer, who is not a scribe, but who was kind of around, and was a prominent figure. And so so those received some notice, and we discuss each of them in detail in the book. So I won't, go into that here, but they're all problematic in one way or another. Emma and Martin's accounts are published posthumously after they're dead. There's, they contradict each other. David has Whitmer, he has an agenda. He now, by this point, is declaring Joseph Smith as a fallen prophet. So it's all mixed up in his promotion of that agenda. So anyway, so there's problems that's all detailed in the book. But the prevailing view was that the Urim and Thummim and Nephite interpreters were the instrument. And that's what you see in church literature up through the late 20th century. And I should point out here that this is not just in the Utah LDS tradition. Joseph Smith III, who did the interview with his mother, or supposed interview with his mother, which contains a stone in the hat account that was published in 1870. No, I'm sorry, 1879. Only a few years later, had occasion, because of what David Whitmer was saying, to go back and do his own research, and changed his mind. And so in 1886, he published a lengthy article repudiating the stone in the hat account. So that was in the what was then the RLDS tradition. They also adhered to the stone in the hat account. And we learned just last night, we did a presentation at the Paul DeVarth group, and we learned just last night that there was a fellow who participates in Paul's group, whose father wrote an article, I think he said 1960, when this stone in the hat started to appear again in the RALDS tradition. His father had written an article which he had revised and rebutting again the stone in the hat account in the from the RALDS point of view, and they found Joseph Smith III's article and pointed to that as being a reason to adhere to the Urim and Thummim interpreters tradition.
Yeah, I have to say, I read that, and it was so fascinating to me because, in one sense, it seemed like the whole stone in the hat thing was like rock solid. They've got all these great witnesses, and everything is like contemporary. And it doesn't jive. Once you actually read the story, and then the fact that Joseph Smith III repudiates this whole idea of the seer stone in the translation process, even after publishing his mom's interview, is truly fascinating, that there was something going on here. And I think, and I kind of look at it this way, I think that Joseph Smith, his early treasure digging days, and he was so closely connected to a seer stone, maybe multiple seer stones, but he used the seer stone. And I think that, and we have the public trial of him, we have all this kind of stuff in the trial records. His reputation was so tied into the seer stone that one can see how the seer stone story would have made its way into the translation process because of his reputation being known as the guy who used the peepstone, the glass looker, all these kind of things. And so then a lot of people could see how that would be. And it does seem like the seer stone in many ways served as a talisman for Joseph. It seemed like something that he carried with him on his person all the time. So one can see how they can conflate the stories of the treasure digging with the translation of the Book of Mormon. I think I can kind of see a narrative now develop that I hadn't seen before, and I think this book really helped open my eyes in that regard too.
Well, and
Yeah, and we
along those lines, let me just mention one thing is whenever you read what someone wrote, you wonder, well, why did they write that? And so when Joseph and Oliver were so specific that they said that they translated with the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates, it was in the context of these rumors about the seer stone. And
and
that's a
Mormonism
context
unveiled.
that people have, yeah, well, Mormonism unveiled, but the other rumors, the newspaper accounts and so on. And people overlook that context. And that's why it's so amazing that the church's own Gospel Topics essay and translation never even quotes what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said. They quote a part of an excerpt where he says it was by the gift and power of God, but they never quote what he said about the Urim and Thummim. And so when you lose that context, you start taking these other statements from David Whitmer and Emma and so on as being the gospel truth instead. And it's just once we dug into them, like you say, it was interesting to see in context who was saying what and why.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
another point is that the story doesn't end. The story
Yeah.
continues because in the 1980s, of course, you get, first of all, the Salamander letter and the other Mark Hoffman forgeries, which draw on this folk magic tradition. And then you have Mike Quinn's Mormonism, the Magic Worldview, which comes out originally in 1987, which really goes full force onto this concept that it all comes out of the folk magic environment of Joseph and his family and the area where he lived. And that just it's because of Mike's kind of dicey history with the church, getting excommunicated, the fact that he was gay and so forth. The official historians tend not to cite him, but his views are stupendously important. And basically, he's one. In other words, the scholarly community has totally bought into basically Mike Quinn's perception of the whole thing, because it's not just a stone in the hat. Lots of LDS working professional LDS scholars now just assume the folk magic background and work in that context. And so one of the things, again, that we do in the book is we try to say, look, we need to, that's informative. The fact that, there was this folk magic going on. And yes, Joseph had a seer stone that he liked to carry around. I refer to it perhaps a bit snarkily as his pet rock. But so you have all that stuff, and we acknowledge that in the book. But we say, the story of the restoration of the gospel has to be separated from that. It's gotten too mired. It's gotten too embedded in this scholarly consensus about the folk magic, and we need to step back and look at it from the point of view of, like Jonathan was saying, looking at the statements, the context in which they were made, and kind of step back and look at it with a fresh pair of 21st century eyes. And it looks a lot different when you do that. So that's sort of, but our book comes out, but the scholarly consensus right now is still leans strongly toward the stone in the hat.
Yeah, yeah, and it's but now let's talk a little bit about the idea of the spectacles, because I think it's important that they enter into the story. Well, they actually enter into the story before the plates are even recovered, as well, and so it's there early on. So let's just talk about the spectacles, the context of the spectacles when they're first identified, and then even just the fact that Joseph seemed to be much more interested in the spectacles. There was something about them that intrigued him, even more so than golden plates. We can talk a little bit about that.
Well, just briefly, the spectacle, the Urim and Thummim, let's use that term just because that's the familiar one to people. I mean, they have an amazing history, again, if you accept LDS scripture, because there's what's in the LDS Doctrine and Covenants section 17, and we learned last night that in the RLDS, or Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants, it's section 15. The Revelation calling the three witnesses, it says at the beginning that the interpreters were made by God for the brother Jared. So if you, and then in the context of the Book of Mormon, we have the account that the Nephites came across the Urim and Thummim while they were out expeditioning and stumbled across some Jaredite ruins. And then the Nephites used them. And then, of course, they were carried down to times of Mormon and Moroni. And then they, of course, left them for Joseph Smith. So if you accept that history, you're looking at objects which are literally thousands of years old, far older than the gold plates. They were made by God, for the purpose of translating and other purposes, because you could get communications and revelations through them as well. So they are quite amazing objects. They're ancient. You had mentioned at the beginning the idea of ancient technology. We would say that they were not produced by an ancient civilization, because we believe that they were created by God. They're celestial technology, not necessarily, but they are ancient and absolutely fascinating objects, pieces of technology that were created using divine, technological means. As Jonathan noted, Orson Pratt said that God's a good mechanic when he was referring to the creation of the Urim and Thummim, which he was making 2 points there that are important. One is that the Urim and Thummim are a manufactured object. In other words, they are created object. It wasn't just a naturally occurring stone, but it was something that God actually manufactured or produced and gave to the brother of Jared, which then got passed down to prophets in the Americas for thousands and thousands of years. And then the other point, of course, is and we also invoke this in the book, is the old kind of LDS tradition that, all truth, Mormonism embraces all truth. In other words, there's no conflict. If science discovers something, then that's part of Mormonism. And we believe that, God works in the universe, uses what we would think of as technology to accomplish his purposes, and that a miracle is not supernatural, but it's rather just God using principles that God understands that we don't understand yet. So it all ties into that old sort of LDS tradition, which we hope also the book kind of revives, because we make that part of our explanation for the interpreters.
Let me just read what Orson Pratt said, because I pulled it up here. Because he said the Urim and Thummim was not something that existed on the earth in a natural state. It was something made by the Lord. He is a good mechanic, as Jim said. He understands how to make things. When he undertakes to do a thing, he does it in the best manner possible, and what he makes is made perfect. He made the Urim and Thummim. 2 crystal stones that he gave unto the brother of Jared were made by him. So that's a fascinating explanation for these, that they were manufactured. And I don't know about the term mechanic. I don't know what he had in mind by that, because I don't think they were mechanical, but and it probably had a different connotation in the 1800s. But the key point is that it was not in a natural state. It was something created. And that's, well, we can get into why that's significant as far as the difference between the peepstone and the Urim and Thummim. But
what I also think is important too is that when you look at the Book of Mormon, also talks about another device, the Liahona, that seems to be pretty sophisticated. It's very technologically advanced. Even when you read Don Bradley's Lost 116 Pages, he kind of expounds on maybe some of the uses that have been used for. It's just really interesting to see that we already have some kind of device in the Book of Mormon as well that would seem to fit within the same kind of in the same grouping as the interpreters would have. So it's just fascinating to think that, yeah, so if we can show that advanced technology was used for Lehi's party, then we can also see how it could have been used in a technology like that. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Well, obviously the modern analogy to the Liahona is a GPS and system. So what seemed like a magic compass in the context of Joseph Smith's time, in our time, we would just look at it and say, well, that's kind of like a super sophisticated GPS. Just like we would say that in our time, we compare the Urim and Thummim interpreters to, as a super sophisticated smartphone, because it not only could do translation, but like I said, you could communicate with it. And as you mentioned, Joseph said he could, I think the quote that you were using was where he said, I can see everything with them. So clearly this is, I think we need to be careful, because clearly these objects, the Liahona and the interpreters, they can do, they're way beyond the technology that we know. So we have to, be sure we always acknowledge that and don't just say it's just like a smartphone,
Right.
or it's just like a GPS. But nonetheless, in the context of the 21st century, it's much easier to understand these as a technology, and they become plausible. Whereas in the 1830s, they seem just, folk magic would be the only analogy in people's culture to help them understand this. But today we can say, oh, no, I mean, they're like technology that we know, probably way, way, way more sophisticated than the technology we know, but we can understand them in terms of 21st century technology.
So I like about how one of the criticisms of the Book of Mormon is all the anachronisms in there. I just want to know, how does 21st century anachronisms make their way into the Book of Mormon?
A great line. Yeah, when Brigham Young said if it had been translated in the late 1800s, it would have read much differently. If it was translated today, it probably would have made a direct analogy to a smartphone. So
yeah,
that's pretty funny, though.
Yeah,
retroactive anachronism. I like that.
So okay, so now I just want to I find the whole idea that we have something like an object that has kind of been put to the side. The Seer Stone narrative becomes the dominant narrative, but there's always been pushback both within the LDS and our LDS traditions. Another voice pushing back against that. So it seems like there's just been these competing narratives going along. Some more prominent than others at other times. For the longest period of time, most members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would have never even heard of the Seer Stone until recently. So they have to try to rethink everything. But then you guys come and say, wait a second, let's explore the other narrative that was that people were using, because again, you guys even point out Joseph and Oliver always talked about the spectacles, the Urim and Thummim, as the means of translation. And they differentiate it. They don't say the stone in the hat. They never talk about that. So we need to also address the fact that the two most prominent people at the time were saying that, and all we have is Emma's, who is posted after she dies about her story of the Seer Stone. So I'd say the earlier accounts are probably the more accurate ones in that regard as well. What do you say to that? Jonathan?
Well, go, Jim, you
Yeah.
started.
Yeah, no, it's, and we make this point in the book. We have a section in the book where it's headed neutral scholarly criteria. So we say Joseph and Oliver consistently said, that they used the Urim and Thummim as the means of interpretation. Now, what about people who don't think that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were truthful? I mean, we have to recognize there's lots of people out there. In fact, a lot of people, and for a long time, who said, well, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were liars. They just made up the Urim and Thummim story to try to hide Joseph's treasure digging background. And the fact they would argue that he used his seer stone in his hat to make the Book of Mormon, that plates and interpreters didn't even exist. I mean, that's a position that lots and lots of people take, and we need to respect that and deal with it. So we have a section in the book where we basically say, okay, let's just assume that the fact that Joseph and Oliver said these things does not a definitive statement. Maybe you don't believe Joseph and Oliver. So let's just look at it, step back and say, take, Mormonism out of it, take Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon and Solomon Spaulding and E.B. Howe out of it, and just assume it was some other kind of historical dispute. So you have on the one side primary firsthand witnesses who wrote contemporaneously or close to contemporaneously with the events. And you have on the other side late, often posthumous accounts that are contradictory and which are actually fairly rare when you actually sort of count everything up. So, just assume that we're arguing about, what happened in a battle in this Revolutionary War or something, just some regular historical thing.
Yeah.
Which are you going to have more credibility? The contemporary accounts of firsthand eyewitnesses who wrote them close in time and actually wrote them and while they were living close in time to the events, or accounts which largely come from 50 years later from people who had an agenda and they're contradictory and they're posthumous and so forth. Just on those kind of neutral grounds, you would have to say that the contemporary firsthand eyewitness accounts, which is Joseph and Oliver, should carry more weight.
Well, and along those lines too, the ones from Joseph and Oliver were carefully written and published. Many of these other accounts were newspaper reporting saying someone said something, which was just hearsay, or, Emma's questionable last testimony, the letter she wrote to Emma Pilgrim, those kind of things are nowhere near the level of preparation and formality of the published statements that Joseph did in the Wentworth letter and the Elders Journal, and of course Oliver Cowdery's letter number 1. So,
and we have to take into account too that she was denying polygamy.
Yeah, well, sure.
And that's interesting. That's part of it too. Like, we know that you scholars, you tell me what you think. But I actually want to talk about the translation process. But there's one other thing I find fascinating is that we take the Book of Mormon literally and we take the Bible literally. We have this thing, the Tower of Babel, and you have this one group that is given the privilege of retaining the Adamic language. Now, I find it fascinating that they're going through, they're traveling, they're going to encounter other people groups, and God gives them the ability to understand the other languages.
Yeah.
And I think that also that could have been a tool in that regard too, that, you guys are so special, you still have the original language, and I'm going to help you not only navigate to get to the new world, but also navigate your correspondence and dealings with other people with different languages. And I think it could also serve as a tool that way as well. Just a thought.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
really
interesting.
good.
Yes.
So I wanted us to talk a little bit about the translation process, like dynamic equivalence, literal translation, because what you're saying is basically that Joseph has these spectacles. They have the ability to look at the Reformed Egyptian, on the plates, and it kind of is able to kind of have English words appear, but then you're also saying that Joseph is not just doing a literal word-for-word translation, but Joseph, the translator, is in the process as well. So we have the words popping up, but then now it's entering into his mind about how this is all going to be laid out. So, Jonathan, why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because you've done a lot of work on the translation
Yeah.
process. Talk about
Well,
that vis-a-vis using the spectacles as an instrument.
Sure. Well, first off, it's fascinating that Joseph specified the title page was a literal translation. So he understood the difference between a literal and a functional translation right there. And you know, if he had been just reading words off a stone, he wouldn't know the difference. So when people say he was using translation meaning something other than what we would normally consider translation, he refuted that pretty well when he distinguished between and I did a little paper. I don't think I published it, showing how the title page differs from the rest of the translation, how it is more of a literal translation. So what we kind of envision and describe in the book is similar to how they would translate the Rosetta Stone. That's why we have a picture of that in the updated version here. Because if you look at how they translated the Rosetta Stone, you can have a literal translation in German, say, or another language. It doesn't really make sense. You have to reformulate it for the grammar and the vocabulary of your audience. And one of the things that we point out in the book here is this Eugene Nida explained that you have to adapt. If you're translating a sacred text, you have to adapt it to people's expectations. And that's why so much of the Book of Mormon sounds like King James or Jonathan Edwards, for that matter, which in my view, of course, it's predominantly King James, secondarily Jonathan Edwards, and then a few other influences. But I think Joseph was...
Can I interrupt here? Just need to do a quick shout out to you, Steve, because we do follow the theories and scholarship of Eugene Nida heavily in our book, apply them to the Book of Mormon. And he, of course, was the executive director of the American Bible Society for decades and decades, and was basically the man who was one of the major figures in the modern thrust of the Protestant movements, various, American Bible Society is Protestant, to get the Bible translated into hundreds of different languages. He oversaw over 200 Bible translations himself personally, and his theories about translation are, widely adopted. And so we use his theoretical framework and apply that to the Book of Mormon. But we give a big shout out, a big credit to Eugene Nida, Reverend Eugene Nida, providing us with the understanding that helped us to formulate our theory of how the translation happened. So
yeah, that's important. I just wanted
another bridge. Go ahead. Yeah,
I just want to say yesterday I had a Zoom call with Thomas Wayment, who has the New Testament translation, and he uses all the tools that evangelical and biblical scholars use. And I asked him, I said, would you say that your translation of the New Testament would kind of be in the same tradition of like the ESV, which is now kind of the standard translation that a lot of evangelicals use? He said, yes, it's very much in the school of thought of the ESV. So we have another example. And by the way, he's telling me that it's being used on a ward level. Okay, so people are using this New Testament translation of his. So that just goes to show how important that our world can also help inform your world. And I do find it fascinating because, yeah, one of the things you point out in the book was that the Book of Mormon had to sound like the King James Version in order for it to sound like Scripture, right? So we can talk about, oh, wow, the over-reliance. That's a naturalistic explanation. We can do that. But we could also look at it as the translator. All he knows is the King James Version cadence. So, of course, if he's encountering this and he's actually working as a translator, it's going to reflect a King James Version cadence because that's what Scripture sounds and looks like, correct?
That's right. And it carries through the Doctrine and Covenants as well. That's how he articulated his revelations in that same kind of a structure.
And Whitmer, when he first started writing the history of the church, wrote in the King James cadence as well. So it was so important back then. So even things that weren't even Scripture necessarily was still sounding like Scripture. So I think that people understand, like, the King James Version just permeates the society, that it just, and when people would pray, they would pray in a King James Version cadence. Even to this day, I go to ward meetings and they're thee and thou. They don't use that in their regular language, but when they're dealing with sacredness, sacred things, they're using a KJV cadence, which I just think that's so important. I don't think we can just easily dismiss that he was just plagiarizing I think we do have to look at him as, in this context, as you guys present him, as a conventional translator.
Yeah, exactly.
So any more on the translation? Like anything else you want to bring about that you think is important for the audience to understand about the role the spectacles played? And also, Jonathan, you also believe that the spectacles and the plates are probably somewhere here on Earth, that they weren't taken away necessarily.
Yeah, that came up in a podcast you and I were on with a few weeks ago, and someone asked the question, "What happened to the golden plates?" And don't tell me an angel took them to heaven. And my response, I was kind of startled by that, and I thought, why would I tell you that? That sounds ridiculous to me. Well, in subsequent conversations, I've learned that several Latter-day Saints had been told that, and others had never heard of it before. But there is a kind of a side tradition that Moroni took them to heaven. And as you know, I think that they still are on Earth, that Joseph and Oliver moved them back to the Hill Shem. But it's again a naturalistic explanation. When you say 99 and 1, I'd say more like 70-30 maybe, because I think there's a little more supernatural in the Urim and Thummim. But you're right. I favor naturalism, because I think these are physical objects that still exist on Earth, and that Mormon spent a lot of time creating when he abridged the record. And there were two different sets of plates, as we've talked about before, and so on. So it's a very naturalistic approach to the physical object, but also to the translation. Because if he used the Urim and Thummim to see these words in another language, but they were English, but they didn't make sense, and it could have even been English terms that people wouldn't have considered sacred, for example. You read Natural Man is an Enemy to God, which from Jonathan Edwards, but I doubt that the Nephites actually wrote those actual words. They wrote something like that, and the functional equivalent was what Jonathan Edwards talked about as the natural man as an enemy to God. Right. That's how I understand the entire Book of Mormon now. Mm-hmm. And to me, it makes it more beautiful and more profound. And maybe not more importantly, but equally important, it's firmly within the Christian tradition. That's what I love about this. Once Christians understand it as a Christian translation, pursuant to Eugene Nida, but also the Jonathan Edwards angle, it should be much easier for them to embrace and accept. Whether they join a church or whatever, that's a separate issue. But as far as accepting the Book of Mormon as a witness of Christ, I'm hoping that this kind of work and this scholarly approach will help Christians reduce the barriers, I guess, so that Christians can start to appreciate it for what it is.
And of course, we also have to talk about the Urim and Thummim is in the Old Testament. It is a type of technology it's hard to explain it other and of course within an ancient context, technology and magic would almost be indistinguishable from each other as well. You guys alluded to that with the Arthur C. Clarke comment as well in that regard. James, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to make two quick points. One is that I just would want to be very clear on, because this is probably one of the major innovations of our model, is the idea that Joseph the Urim and Thummim were giving him a more formal equivalent, that's the Nida term, more literalistic translation, and then he, following the process that's described in Doctrine and Covenants section 9, had to study out in his mind how to restate it in contemporary English. And of course, he was going to use the most high prestige language he knew, which was the King James Bible, and things from preachers like Jonathan Edwards were very, very highly regarded in his environment. And then he would restate it, but he would then go to the Lord and get a confirmation of that this was in fact a good translation to do. So the process, we need to be careful about not making a hard distinction between naturalistic and supernatural, because in our view they blend together. In other words, the naturalistic operation of the Urim and Thummim technology then blended into Joseph seeking inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that in fact he was on the right track with the particular phrasing that he had come up with. The other point I'd like to make is that this sort of dual process, two-step process, also accounts for the Book of Mormon text that we have. because the Book of Mormon text we have is a weird dual structure. You have 1820s English, yet underneath, at least LDS scholars have found many Hebraic poetic forms and grammar. There's this highly convoluted plot, and there are ancient, coronation ceremonies and Jewish festivals and so forth that all underlay the text. And so that's our two-step process, is our proposal to explain that. In other words, Joseph would get this stuff in a relatively literalistic form from the Urim and Thummim, and those would then, that's why Hebraic forms would flow through into his translation as he was rethinking it in 1820s English for the functionally equivalent translation that he produced. So it's a bit of a complicated process, but we believe it actually explains the Book of Mormon text as we have it. These kind of dual features.
Yeah, one other point to make there is that even though he would pray and get confirmation that what he was writing was correct, he later went back and revised it. So it wasn't word perfect like the Quran, where it could not be changed. But in the 1840 edition, as we point out in the book, he right on the cover, it says, carefully revised by the translator, which is what a translator always does. It was not a Quranic kind of a perfect, unchangeable text.
Yeah, fascinating. And again, too, it's the idea that, I look at it this way. I'm more open to the idea that some kind of device was used that is of maybe ancient technology. And I alluded to, like, for instance, we found that ancient computer that was found in the Mediterranean that would have, I think, even predated Christ, an ancient Greek, I forget what to call it. It's a big, long name. But yeah. And so we know that ancients did have some sophisticated technology that they're dealing with. So I'm looking at this naturalistically. Let's say that there's, in theory, there is some kind of mechanical device that would have been used for doing the translation. We do have precedent that we do know that there was ancient technology, and I'm not saying like Eric von Daniken, type kind of technology, but I'm just talking about the idea that the man was maybe much more sophisticated than we would realize it. And so then I think that makes more sense to me, because it's still naturalistic, because you could argue whether it was made by God or not. Maybe it was just made by an advanced civilization. Maybe it was, we don't know, because I'm going to speak naturalistically. But I have an object that's able to do something that I can understand within a 21st century context, not necessarily a 19th century context. Or we have this idea of this magical stone with words appearing on them. Then it all becomes magic, and it all becomes supernatural, and it becomes less than to a 21st century mind. It becomes too foreign, and as a Christian, it just seems to not make any sense in a post-Enlightenment Protestant world. I was raised a Calvinist, very logical. That story doesn't make any sense to me. I don't believe that there was a rock that had words appear on it. I just don't buy into that at all. But I'm more apt to look at your approach as being more legitimate and actually more naturalistic than the other way.
Well, and the other issue with the peepstone is you can question what the source of the words was, right? Because there's a whole strain of Christianity that thinks the Book of Mormon is satanic and so on, because it takes people away from the real Christ of the Bible and so on. And that peepstone lends itself to that approach, because you could easily see how an occult object could mislead people and lead them astray. In fact, we had that example in church history with Hiram Page himself, using a peepstone for the wrong reason. And so that's another reason to argue that God would prepare a translation device to make sure that it was a divinely approved process. And it would be, it's one of the reasons I think Joseph Smith emphasized that he used the Urim and Thummim and not some peepstone.
So you guys, I was in it briefly, a presentation last night that you guys gave to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. And you guys had told, there was a geologist in the call, and he pointed out that the stone that the church has that is believed to be the Seer stone is actually from Wyoming. I never heard that before, but Wyoming's right on the way to Utah on top of it. Can you talk a little bit about that observation that was made last night?
Well, do you want me to talk about it, Jim, real quick? Or
Well, the point that Jerry was making was that we were talking about the stone swapping story that is a secondhand story from Martin Harris, supposedly, where Martin switched out. They were down by the river. He found a rock he felt looked like the seer stone he'd seen Joseph having, and he switched them out, and then Joseph couldn't translate. And that's used as evidence. That's the Martin Harris evidence of the seer stone in the hat narrative. And we argue that that's an unlikely story. You know, we think it's not credible that Joseph didn't recognize that he'd switched out the rocks. And so our geologist friend pointed out that if it's that brown striped rock that is in the church archives, that particular rock is a rock that's only is not it's almost never found in North America east of Wyoming. That's what he was saying. So he was saying the idea that Martin Harris could find in eastern Pennsylvania any kind of a rock that actually really resembled that rock is extraordinarily unlikely, which makes it much more likely. It reinforces our view that Joseph was not fooled by Martin Harris, that he recognized that it was that Martin had switched out the rocks, and he kind of went along with it because he knew this was important to Martin at the time. Sort of as a, he instead of getting mad at Martin or mocking him for this stupid trick that he was trying to pull, he kind of went along with it because, he was trying to be charitable and Christian toward Martin. So that's our view of the thing. And the fact that to find a rock that actually looks like that in eastern Pennsylvania is would have been almost impossible. And I mean, it's so unlikely. That was the point our friend was making. But
well,
Jonathan has another take on it.
Well, the related point to that is, where did this rock come from? It sounds to me, if it's found in Wyoming and it was from the stomach of a dinosaur or something, it sounds to me like it might be something Brigham Young picked up during the wagon train to the journey to Utah through Wyoming. And so I thought, well, I haven't looked into that to see if we know exactly where, but I think it was Zina Young who bought that from Brigham's estate. And that's how it ended up in the church's hands today. So there's questions about the provenance of that particular stone. And as we talked about how Emma said it was chocolate covered or chocolate appearing, that stone has a layer of chocolate, but it's more like a layer cake, right? It's not, you wouldn't characterize that as looking like a piece of chocolate. And I have a replica of that stone. I just didn't bring here today, but we've all seen pictures of it and it doesn't look like chocolate. So we may be talking about a stone that Brigham Young picked up on the trail.
Yeah, you never know. And it's fascinating just to hear that last night. I was like, oh, really? That's fascinating. And have a geologist actually say that's that was interesting. Well, guys, I just want to say, first of all, folks, the name of the book is by the means of the Urim and Thummim, restoring restoring translation to the restoration, co-authored by James Lucas and Jonathan Neville. It is through Digital Legend, our publisher. What's his name? What's the publisher?
Boyd Tuttle.
Boyd Tuttle. Good, my buddy Boyd Tuttle, who sent me a ton of your books, Jonathan. I think I have almost your entire library because of your friend Boyd. So it's published by Digital Legends. I'm going to have a link in the description for those of you who would like to purchase the book. Anything else before I let you two go?
Go ahead, Jim. You always have something to say.
No, I would just reemphasize that to go back to this supernatural distinction, there is a school in the church that adopts the stone in the hat theory, but doesn't think that it's words appearing on the hat. The scholars say it was more like the Quran, where Joseph was just having visions and inspiration. And I'd like to make it clear that we are not ruling out. This is not a naturalistic versus a revelation distinction. It's because we do follow Doctrine and Covenants section 9, in fact, very closely. And this was a process where Joseph wasn't seeking the guidance of the Holy Spirit as he was working with the technology that the Lord had provided him to produce the translation. So I think that's important to emphasize.
Now, where can people get this hat, by the way?
Boyd Tuttle has them at Digital Legends. I don't know if
But
you
the
put him
blue
up on
the
his
blue one
website.
looks better, I think.
I like the
Because
blue one. That's my color. Yeah. Okay, so if
But
so,
anyway, I don't know if he has him up on his website, but you can contact Boyd
oh, okay.
Tuttle at Digital Legend.
we'll make
Excellent.
sure he sends you one, Steve.
Yeah, that's good.
A blue one. You get a
Well,
blue
blue
one.
one. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan.
One last thing I'd like to say is, and this has come up recently, the idea of the stone in the hat versus Urim and Thummim, they both involved inspiration.
Mhm.
So we're not denying that at all. And
Yeah, see,
I just
I can speak as an outsider, kind of make my observations. And the reason why I do that is because I want to make the Book of Mormon more accessible to even a secular audience.
Yeah.
You know, so that they can maybe encounter it a little bit differently with maybe a little bit more of an open mind. The fact that there's precedent that we have ancient technology that has existed. You could argue that this all happened and it was all naturalistic, right?
Yeah,
That's
you could.
you know,
You
and that's
could.
what makes it so fascinating. And
Yeah.
just to think about on those levels, you know, maybe there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye. And
Yeah.
and I find that to be much more interesting than just taking one position and that's it. And I ain't changing my mind. I'm like, no, let's
Absolutely.
explore. Let's see where these things go. And like I am an outsider, I can bring my perspective to it, kind of like you guys are outsiders. I think it actually helps inform the conversation that much better. And folks, what did you think of today's conversation? What do you think? Stone in the hat. The interpreters, the Nephite or Jaredite interpreters, the Urim and Thummim. You know, fascinating stuff just to think and contemplate. And as people who are believers in this stuff, I think it's important that you know have these conversations, and you have a lot of history that can inform this as well. Jonathan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, one last thought, just as you were talking, for a younger generation, having a Urim and Thummim as a high-tech instrument is far more interesting than the stone in the hat. And, you know, I think that's a major, I don't want to say an error, but it's to focus on this idea of inoculating with the stone in the hat is more like infecting with the stone in the hat, because it just doesn't make sense to anybody, really. You almost have to cram it into people's minds for them to believe it. But a high-tech object that Joseph Smith had that it was thousands of years old, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's the story.
That's the direction we're heading. So
okay, I like it. It's interesting.
And I would point out one other aspect of this for reframing is that a whole nother subject, which we go into in the book, which we didn't really talk about here, was rethinking how we think of Joseph Smith and the fact that he, in fact, had a lot of self-education, that he was very knowledgeable of the Bible. He was very knowledgeable about Christian teachings from people like Jonathan Edwards, and that he was, in fact, so we like to, our sort of bottom line is that we need to think of the Jaredite Nephite interpreters in terms of high technology, and that Joseph Smith was a nerd. That's our reframe for
all right,
technology nerd.
Love it.
All right, cool.
All right, guys. Well, this was great hanging out with you today. Just want to remind
Yeah.
you though, that there will be links in the description for everything we talked about today. Those of you who would like to financially support the channel, of course, can support us on Patreon as well as PayPal. Don't forget MormonBookReviews.com. We have our merch store with hot chocolate mugs, hats, t-shirts, you name it, we got it. And we're always grateful for those of you who financially support the channel. And I want to thank everybody who is. And just remember, the most important thing, folks, is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.